Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's video was penned by Radu Alexander, so be sure to drop your support for the man's writing in the comments and tell us who your favorite Roman soldier was while you're at it. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Caligula, Commodus, Pertinax, Caracalla, and of course who could forget Pupienus. These are just some of the Roman emperors who ended their reigns and their lives at the hands of the Praetorian Guard. Although it was an elite unit meant to serve as bodyguards for the emperor, the guard looked after its own interests first and foremost. If anyone clashed with those interests, then they could be marked for death, even if they happened to rule over the Roman Empire. Many emperors feared the Praetorian Guard and went to great lengths to stay on its good side. Famed 18th century historian Edward Gibbon decried the Praetorian bands whose licentious fury was the first symptom and cause of the decline of the Roman Empire. But was it true that a single military unit wielded so much power and had that much influence on the history of Rome? Let's find out. Although the Praetorian Guard as an official unit appeared at the outset of the Roman Empire, its origins lie in the 3rd century BC during the time of the Republic. Back then, certain military commanders, called praetors, thought it would be a good idea in certain situations to protect themselves with temporary bodyguards. Sounds reasonable, right? We're not sure how big these units were at first, but we do know that in 133 BC, during the siege of Numantia, General Scipio Aemilianus formed one such unit out of 500 men, or about the size of a cohort. This was unusually large and was commented on by his contemporaries, and from that point on, such bodyguard contingents became known as cohorts, praetoria, or Praetorian cohort. The Praetorians did not have many moments of glory during the Republic years, but they did step up to the plate in 62 BC during the failed coup attempt known as the Catiline Conspiracy. Here's a quick rundown. A politician named Lucius Sergius Catilina, or simply Catiline, instigated a plot to take over the Republic by overthrowing the 2 Roman consuls in charge at the time. A guy named Gaius Antonius Hybrida, or Cicero or Cicero. Eventually, Cicero exposed the conspiracy. Catiline was forced to flee Rome to where his army was sitting and waiting, while his co-conspirators were caught and executed without trial on Cicero's orders. Historians have debated whether or not he was in the right doing this, and this is a subject we'll discuss in depth in our future bio on Cicero. Stay tuned for that one. Anyway, all of Catiline's allies were dead, but he still had an army, so he thought, why not? If he were caught, he would be executed, so he might as well try to take down the government. Consequently, Catiline's army fought the Republican forces led by Marcus Petraius at the Battle of Pistoria in early January 62 BC. Now, Catiline only had a few thousand soldiers. We're not sure how many Petraius had, we just know that it was more. So he started the battle with a significant advantage. Here's the thing though. All of Catiline's men were veteran legionaries who fought under Sulla and had seen plenty of action. They were kicking the asses of the Republican forces and were on the verge of victory, but in a moment of inspiration, Petraius called upon his Praetorian cohort from the reserve, and together they led the charge right into the center of the enemy line. Catiline's soldiers fought fiercely until the last man, but the Praetorians outshined them that day. A rare moment when we have something positive to say about them. Spoilers, not a lot more to come. Do you have a bad habit you'd like to kick? And no, we can't help you if your bad habit is selling out the Roman Empire to the highest bidder. And we all do things that aren't exactly good for us, and you might be thinking about ditching a habit for something healthier. Well, you might be surprised to find out that flavored air is quickly becoming a leading alternative to habits like smoking or vaping. The idea is that whatever your habit happens to be, like my habit of crushing a box of generic salty cheese crackers, you can replace it with something like what the fantastic sponsor of today's Biographics episode is offering, a fume device. Now, this is not a vape. There are no electronics, no combustion, no fire necessary, but it makes for an excellent fidget spinner. It's a flavored air device, complete with these plant-based flavor cores that get packed right inside this stylish device. Right now, orange vanilla seems to be my favorite. Flavored air isn't like vaping at all, in fact. If you were to compare it to soda, the cores offered by Fume are a lot closer to herbal tea. Fume draws flavor into your mouth without any of the vapor or addictive stuff like nicotine that comes with other habits. There are no batteries, so you can literally take it anywhere and use it anywhere. And Fume continuously invests in third-party studies to ensure the safety of their products. It's even backed by doctors here in the US. The award-winning Fume flavor device has been served to over 300,000 customers, and you can be the next success story. For a limited time, use our code Biographics to get your free topper. It's the perfect accessory for your Fume device. Slip it onto the mouthpiece for a softer, warmer feel. It's also chewable for those of you who love to fidget, and it's reusable. Head to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code Biographics or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume topper when you order your journey pack today. Now, back to the Praetorian Guard. We now advance a few decades to a time of great turmoil for Rome. It was 44 BC. Years earlier, Julius Caesar had launched a civil war that saw the fall of the Republic and his ascent as dictator of Rome. But then he was assassinated during the Ides of March, and it was up to his former allies to avenge him, mainly Octavian and Mark Antony. During that time, both men had large Praetorian cohorts that numbered in the thousands, all loyal veterans recruited from the ranks of Caesar's soldiers. Ultimately, Octavian and Antony triumphed against Caesar's assassins in the Liberator's Civil War, and alongside Lepidus, formed the second triumvirate to rule over Rome. But they didn't get along with each other either, and after a lot more fighting, eventually Octavian emerged alone on top of the mountain. He took the name Augustus, and in 27 BC began his reign as the first emperor of the newly formed Roman Empire. Augustus liked his Praetorians since he learned firsthand from Caesar the advantages of having an army at your disposal that was loyal to you personally, instead of your position or your rank. Plus, now that the armies of Rome weren't divided between various factions fighting each other anymore, he had soldiers to spare. So he formed the first permanent bodyguard unit tasked with protecting himself and the royal family, and it was called the Praetorian Guard. Or we called it that, to be more exact. The term is a modern one, while the Romans called it cohors praetoria, just like before. That brings us to an interesting question. Just how many soldiers were there in the Praetorian Guard? There's no definitive answer since the number changed a lot throughout the Guard's 300-year history. We know that the Guard formed by Augustus consisted of 9 cohorts of approximately 500 men each, so it originally had 4,500 soldiers-ish. However, that number would change almost immediately as the emperors who followed kept adding cohorts, while others removed them. At its peak, the Praetorian Guard had 15,000 soldiers, which is nuts. Because he didn't want to be seen as a military tyrant, Augustus only stationed 3 cohorts in Rome, while the rest were quartered in other towns throughout Italy, but still close to the capital. However, this too would change soon enough once the Praetorians had their own barracks built on the outskirts of Rome called the Castra Praetoria. Recruitment of Praetorians was done mostly from Italian ranks, although the records show that some recruits came from other lands such as Germany, Thrace, and Pannonia. And while the bodyguards during the Republic era were all veteran soldiers, Augustus preferred to recruit young men from good families, and this became the norm going forward, barring a few exceptions here and there. Service in the Praetorian Guard started out at 12 years, but was bumped up to 16 still during the reign of Augustus. Most days, being a Praetorian was a pretty sweet gig, so it wasn't surprising that the soldiers wanted it as long as possible. However, we should point out that the sole duty of the Praetorians wasn't just to follow the emperor around. Some of them acted as speculators, basically spies, and gathered intelligence, engaged in espionage, made arrests, and even performed assassinations in order to safeguard the emperor and protect the interests of the empire. There are a few mentions in the historical record that on occasion, the Praetorians also helped out with much more mundane tasks, such as assisting the fire department to put out a fire or serving as crowd control during the arena games. There is one noteworthy event that stands out, the Naumachii, staged by Claudius in 52 AD. A nameki was a mock naval battle, organized the same way as gladiator or animal fights, except, in water. They were much rarer events simply because they were a lot more expensive, time-consuming, and required more bodies for the slaughter, but the spectacle staged by Claudius was almost as grand as the real thing. Taking place on Lake Fucino, this nameki involved 100 ships and 19,000 men, all of them condemned criminals who would have been executed anyway. This way, if they fought bravely and pleased the crowd, some of them might have had a shot at a reprieve. On this occasion, the Praetorians got involved in the games themselves, stationed around the lake on rafts and ramparts, armed with catapults, just in case the convicts got any funny ideas. Fun history fact for you. Suetonius wrote that at the start of this nameki, the criminals shouted at Claudius, Ave Imperator Moritori te salutant, or something to that effect, meaning, Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. In modern times, this has become known as some sort of greeting that gladiators address to the emperor before fighting, but this is the only known example of this phrase in the historical record, and it took place during a nameki, not an arena fight. And it was said by convicted criminals, not gladiators. So, sorry, this probably was not a common salute in ancient times, although the AC/DC version still applies. After Augustus was gone, it didn't take long for the Praetorian Guard to gain a lot more power than it should have. And it was all thanks to a devious and ambitious rascal by the name of Sejanus. When Augustus formed the Praetorian Guard, he put 2 people in charge of it, called Praetorian prefects. He was then followed on the throne by his stepson Tiberius, who, although an effective administrator and even a successful general in his younger days, lacked the determination, willpower, and charisma of his stepfather to be a forceful leader. Therefore, he passed along a lot of his responsibilities to Sejanus, who served as Praetorian prefect. And he did it solo, by the way. He didn't have a co-prefect. And then, in 26 AD, after the deaths of the emperor's son and nephew, Tiberius retired to the island of Capri and allowed Sejanus to become the de facto ruler of the empire. Sejanus was a villain through and through, with an unquenchable lust for power. In fact, he was such a scoundrel that he might get his own bio one day. Wink. He tried to marry into the royal family multiple times without success. When that didn't work, historian Tacitus openly accused him of poisoning the emperor's son, Drusus, so that Tiberius wouldn't get any ideas of ceding power to him. Once Sejanus was in charge, he controlled almost all the communication that reached the emperor in Capri, and he began a purge of rich and powerful Romans who might pose a threat to him. After years went by when Tiberius hadn't been seen in the capital, most people accepted Sejanus as the leader of Rome. He got engaged to a member of the royal family, there were statues erected in his honor, and his birthday had even become a holiday. Sejanus felt like he was untouchable, and then he wasn't. Something happened toward the end of 31 AD, and Sejanus was summarily arrested and executed. Frustratingly, we're not sure what, because that part of Tacitus's account is missing. Centuries later, however, Cassius Dio wrote that Tiberius finally found out about all the shenanigans Sejanus had been up to, so he had him secretly replaced as Praetorian prefect and then had him arrested with the help of the cohorts urbani, essentially the Roman police. As Praetorian prefect, Sejanus enacted multiple reforms that benefited the Praetorians. He was the one who built the Castra Praetoria and brought all of the cohorts into Rome to have them nearby in case things got hairy. In the centuries that followed, the office of Praetorian prefect would gain more functions and benefits, basically becoming one of the top aides of the emperor. However, few of them would ever hold as much power as Sejanus. At this point, the Praetorian Guard was only a few decades old, and already it had become fairly obvious that it might wield a little too much power. But this was only the beginning, because the Praetorians went on to have a much more direct and drastic effect on the course of Roman history when they began straight up assassinating old emperors and installing new ones as they saw fit. This happened right after Tiberius, who was followed on the throne by the infamous Caligula. To be fair, Caligula wasn't exactly a people person, so there were plenty in Rome who wanted him dead. But it was 2 Praetorians named Cassius Chaerea and Cornelius Sabinus who actually got the job done and stabbed the emperor to death. But then there was some dissension within the ranks of the Guard. Sharia was in league with the senators who wanted to restore the Republic, but the other Praetorians feared this would cause them to lose power. Instead, they looked for a suitable new emperor among the royal family. Not an easy thing to do since Caligula killed most of them. But they found him in Claudius, an uncle who was never seen as much of a threat because he had several physical disabilities. But the Praetorian Guard wasn't picky, so they acclaimed Claudius as the new emperor and then forced the Senate to accept him. At least on this occasion, the Guard killed a murderous nutjob and supported a guy who turned out to be a pretty good emperor. We'll add it to the good column, even if it was unintentional since the Praetorians did it to save their own jobs. But let's look at what happened after Claudius. Another whack job followed him you're probably pretty familiar with. A guy named Nero. Emperor Nero was cool with the Guard for the first decade of his reign. He kept them happy and they turned a blind eye to all of his extracurricular activities. But eventually the people had had enough and everyone started to turn on the emperor. When he found himself with no allies left, Nero self-deleted, and with him died the Julio-Claudian dynasty. No more obscure uncles to proclaim emperor this time, and this led Rome into a succession crisis known as the Year of the Four Emperors. When Nero was still alive, his Praetorian prefect, a guy named Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, convinced the Guard to turn on the emperor and support a contender for the throne named Galba in exchange for money. Then, there was a strange interlude after Nero was dead, but before Galba had arrived in Rome when Sabinus had a change of heart and decided that he should be emperor after all. However, the other Praetorians disagreed and killed Sabinus, firmly convinced that Galba was the right man for the job, and that the job meant paying them lots of money. Here's the thing though, when we say lots of money, we mean it. Sabinus promised the Praetorians 7,500 sesterci per man and 1,250 sesterci for those in service outside of Rome. According to Plutarch, this was a sum which it was impossible to raise without inflicting 10,000 times more evils upon the world than those inflicted by Nero. Unsurprisingly, Galba didn't have it, and after a few months of stalling, the Guard got tired of waiting and turned on him on the way to the Roman Forum. As the soldiers approached to kill the emperor, only one Praetorian stayed loyal, a centurion by the name of Sempronius Densus, who tried in vain to protect Galba and received a fatal wound to the groin for his efforts. They literally stabbed him in the dick. So now Galba was dead, and the Praetorian Guard sided with the new guy, Otho. Many of the guards smeared their clothes and swords in Galba's blood and went up to Otho claiming they were the ones who killed the emperor. 120 of them gave him written petitions for rewards, and those would come in handy just a little later. Unfortunately for the Praetorians, they backed the wrong horse on this one. Remember, this is still the Year of the Four Emperors, and we've only had two so far. The third one, Vitellius, was on his way to Rome to challenge Otho, and after winning at the Battle of Bodyguards, Vitellius became the new emperor and Otho self-deleted. One of the few things that Vitellius did was to disband the entire Praetorian Guard and form a new one using trusted soldiers from the ranks of his own army. And all those Praetorians who wrote petitions claiming they murdered Galba, he had them all executed. Which goes to show you that it was true back then just as it is now. If you're going to commit a crime, don't leave a paper trail. In theory, disbanding the original Guard was a smart thing to do. The old one clearly could not be trusted. However, Vitellius just created a large armed force with no leader that also hated him. Where was it going to go? Unsurprisingly, it joined up with the fourth and final contender to the throne, Vespasian. The two sides fought at the Second Battle of Bodyguards, and after some Praetorian on Praetorian action, Vespasian emerged triumphant while Vitellius was dragged out of the palace and executed on the streets of Rome. With Vespasian on the throne, the Flavian dynasty brought some much-needed stability to Rome. He kept the Praetorian Guard, although he took multiple steps to minimize any potential risks. He reduced the Guard's size back to 9 cohorts again, he recruited soldiers from the ranks of Otho, Vitellius, and his own army, and he installed his son, future Emperor Titus, as the Praetorian prefect. These moves worked well, and for the next 100 plus years there wasn't much written about the Praetorians. Unsurprisingly, this coincided with a period of strong leadership for Rome. First, the Flavians, and then the Nerva Antonine dynasty, or the so-called Five Good Emperors. Sure, there were still some hiccups. Both of Domitian's Praetorian prefects, Titus Petronius Secundus and Titus Flavius Norbanus, were implicated in the emperor's assassination. But at least the other Praetorians were angry about it and killed Secundus to avenge Domitian. We're not sure what happened to Norbanus. Other than that, the Praetorians were mostly used as regular soldiers during this period, most notably during Trajan's campaign against Dacia and Parthia. But that changed when Commodus assumed power and the Guard was up to its old tricks again. Under his reign, the leaders of the Praetorians gained massive influence and used it to enrich themselves and get rid of opponents, particularly a guy called Cleander and the Praetorian prefect Laetus, who helped plot Commodus's assassination and the rise of the new emperor Pertinax. But Pertinax got it into his head that the Guard needed more discipline and tried to reform it. Unsurprisingly, to no one's surprise, the Praetorians didn't like that. So they killed Pertinax too, just 3 months into his reign. After that, the Praetorian Guard made arguably its ballsiest move yet, even more so than assassinating an emperor, which, let's be honest, someone had to do it. They auctioned off the Roman Empire. Basically, at that point, whoever the Guard wanted as emperor would become emperor since they were the most powerful military force in Rome. And they decided to give their support to the highest bidder after a bidding war outside the Castra Praetoria. The winner was Didius Julianus, and his grand prize was to serve as Roman emperor for 2 whole months before being killed as well. If it's not out already, look out for a bio on him soon to cover this shameful episode in detail. Described by Cassius Dio as the most disgraceful business and one unworthy of Rome. After Julianus came the Severan dynasty. Its founder, Septimius Severus, tried to reform the Praetorian Guard again by disbanding the old guard and creating a new one with soldiers from his army. But it didn't last. During the reign of his son, Caracalla, the Praetorian prefect Macrinus plotted the emperor's murder and then successfully proclaimed himself the new emperor, ruling for 1 year before being executed. And then, guess what? The guy who followed him, Elagabalus, was also killed by the Praetorians. Then he had his head chopped off and his body stripped naked, dragged through the streets, and thrown in the river. So, not a very popular guy. A decade and a half later, during the year of the 6 emperors, 2 co-emperors, Balbinus and Pupienus, were also killed by the Praetorian Guard. We talked about this recently in our bio for Maximinus Thrax, but if I'm being honest, we brought this up just to have an excuse to say Pupienus again. Can you blame us? After that came the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of great turmoil and instability for the Roman Empire. There wasn't much written about the Praetorian Guard during that time, probably because there was chaos all around, so their shenanigans didn't stand out as much. The only notable episode left in the history of the Praetorian Guard was its demise, which came at the hands of Constantine the Great. And yes, we are definitely going to do a bio on him too. During the early 4th century, Constantine was embroiled in a civil war with 2 other emperors, Maxentius and Licinius. Maxentius had the support of the Praetorian Guard, but they bet on the wrong horse again. Constantine defeated him in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where Maxentius drowned in the river Tiber. After that, Constantine realized that the Praetorian Guard was beyond redemption and did what probably another emperor should have done hundreds of years earlier. He permanently dissolved the Praetorian Guard in 313 AD. He destroyed the Castra Praetoria and whatever Praetorians were left, he distributed among legions in the far corners of the empire. And thus, after 4 centuries of conspiracies, betrayals, bribes, and assassinations, the Praetorian Guard was no more, although it had already left an indelible mark on history.
And don't forget to check out today's sponsor. Head to tryfume.com. That's tryfum.com and use code Biographics or scan the QR code on screen to get your free Fume topper when you order your journey pack today.
That's all we've got for you today. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz, like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves history and historical figures. And be sure to keep it tuned here to Biographics for more videos just like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.